Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics, podcast where we seek to explore the more unexplored topics in gaming, how they work, why they work, and of course, why we love them. My name's Greg. With me, as always, is our host, Mark.
Hello there.
On the other side of the country. And today, we're going to pick up a discussion that we had from last week, or started last week a little bit. But there's a lot to talk about. So we're going to be talking about difficulty in video games. Specifically video games. We didn't really go into other types of games this week, but that might be okay. So
yeah, we're gonna have plenty to cover.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're not gonna fall short on stuff because as a lifelong gamer for both of us, we've both had pretty intensive experiences of video game difficulty on both ends. I can personally remember being a young lad and having certain games that made me basically have to turn off the PlayStation in frustration and leave.
Wow, when you were a young warthog.
When I was, yeah. Yeah, back in Serengeti. But yeah, also, I mean, I think part of this too is that I've been playing a lot of Diablo 3 lately. I've picked that up once every 8 months maybe. And that game has a very, very specific difficulty system that I have a lot of thoughts on.
Mm-hmm.
Last time Mark came to visit me up in the Great North, I live in Michigan. Mark's down in the far south. We just picked up Dark Souls just to play through because neither one of us had played it, and took a few days and played a lot of Dark Souls. So I think any discussion of video game difficulty would be incomplete without that series.
Yeah,
being included, but.
Yeah, and that's always held up as sort of the paragon of difficulty by a lot of hardcore gamers. But we'll have more to say about that later on in the episode because I think it does do a good job, but I don't think it's necessarily for the reasons that people praise it.
Yeah,
it's not just because it's really hard. Like that isn't what makes the difficulty in Dark Souls good.
Right, exactly. And just a hard game is not. There's plenty of very hard games. Dark Souls is also a very good game, which is important.
Right.
I think people tend to be like, yeah, it's so, and I think part of it too was maybe even the first Dark Souls came out in a time where that type of game that required tons of patience, that was incredibly punishing, that required something very different of the player other than kind of run and gun and kind of just a sense of overpoweredness as the player character was relatively undone at that point. I mean, indie games weren't nearly as big back then. And I think it's a source where you see a lot of kind of more difficult games nowadays. But in any case, yeah, it's not just straight up, hey, you die a lot in Dark Souls, so it's good. It's like, no, it's also a very, very good game, and it uses its difficulty very intelligently, and
right.
The system works well. So
cool.
So
well,
anywho,
let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're gonna say more about what makes difficulty good before we talk about Dark Souls and why it does a good job with that.
Yep.
Last time we talked about two different types of difficulty in Left 4 Dead, and I guess just Diablo is a great example of this too, of the difference between boosting numbers in a game to make it more difficult, and then actually adding mechanics to the game, things that you've got to play around that are harder or just different than if you were to play the game on normal. We talked about it in the context of AI specifically, how you can add a new strategy for an AI on a harder difficulty that might be more effective in defeating the player. So now they've got to deal with a different sort of scenario than if they were just starting off. Diablo, of course, is notorious for being able to scale numbers as high as you want. And that really is the core mechanic of difficulty there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Diablo actually is entire. I was trying to think of like any change in difficulty that changes the way the monsters act or how you as a player can interact. The only one thing, there's a mode in Diablo 3 at least called hardcore, where if you die, it's just permanent death, right? If your character dies, you lose everything of that character.
Mm-hmm.
But past that, no, changing difficulty changes nothing about the game other than just the numbers of how much health you have and how much health and damage the enemy monsters have. I suppose one small mechanical thing is at certain levels of difficulty, certain types of gear become more, drop rates get higher, right? You get more gold, more drop rates. So it's not just there's greater rewards as well, right? That's kind of the whole Diablo game system is kind of the classic gear treadmill of getting more gear
Right.
so that you can play on a higher difficulty. But why do you want to play on a higher difficulty? Well, it's because they have higher rates to get more gear and more gold, and so you just continually do that and that until unless you're pushing
Hmm.
the very very kind of top end tier stuff, which is trying to really, like you said, there actually is unlimited difficulty in Diablo in one aspect of the game where you can continually unlock more difficult. They're little dungeons basically
Right.
called rifts that are completely self-contained, and if you can beat a more difficult one, then there's a leaderboard for that. But past that, which I don't think many people push the absolute top tier of that, there's no end game to it. It's just continually getting loot and all that jazz. So especially like if you were to change
Right.
compare
Yeah.
that to a game like Dark Souls or even Left 4 Dead, right? That has a very definitive end. I mean, Diablo has a story mode, but that's you know one 1% of the game experience nowadays.
Yeah. Diablo is really made to be played again and again, and
Right.
I think that that's what Diablo is. Like it's a game where you go to slay monsters and you don't necessarily go to strategize. That may be unfair to people who are really hardcore Diablo players. I realize that at the very top levels, like you were saying, there's a point where the items aren't going to get any better. And so the only way that you can progress further is to get better just mechanically at the dungeons. But that's the very, very top.
Yeah, and yeah, to be fair, there's levels of creativity that can go in, particularly because there's so much RNG, kind of randomness to the game. Very rarely will you get exactly that perfect set build, that you see online. So you kind of have to work with what you do have, and there's levels of creativity there, and being able to make different items work together and see synergies and that sort of thing. But the problem with that, at least in my mind, or here's my issue with it, at least, is I can only play Diablo every time I try to pick Diablo up again. I tend to only be able to last like a couple weeks, if that, as I'm playing it, because for this kind of exact reason, which is no matter where you're at, you can tune. There's in once you beat the game, there's actually 13 distinct levels of difficulty. After there's like normal, hard, expert, and yada yada. Then they go into something called torment, and they're just torment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 13, and each one is just progressively more difficult and has higher drop rates and gold. Um, the problem is with having like 13 distinct actual difficulties, you can actually pretty much literally, no matter what character you have, and no matter what gear you have, you can basically tune the difficulty to exactly how difficult you want the game to be to your build.
Hmm.
Which on one hand sounds like a good thing, right? Like if you don't have, like I said, all this really ideal gear, and you want to still have the game feel good to play, not just complete curb stomp and not just completely getting murdered, then you can really kind of fine tune and find a place where no matter what gear you have, you can feel good. But the problem with that is the core progression of the game, the point of playing the game, isn't to stay stagnant. The idea is that you want to keep on pushing that. You're trying to get into the next level, right?
Right.
You're trying to get good enough to get to the next torment level. So inevitably, at least what I do, and I think a lot of people do, I won't necessarily be creative. I won't work together with um, all the pieces I have, especially some. I'll only try to min max and look for things that are push my build to the. If I have one weapon that's better than everything else, then I feel kind of like, especially if that has a certain way to play with that weapon, then I feel very much narrowed and kind of confined into making that weapon work and playing as good as possible with that,
Hmm.
and then moving to the next play. So it's a weird sense of like, yeah, and Blizzard's done so many things to try to encourage that dynamic play of being able to use, be creative and find new builds um, and they really did a good job of making that very accessible, in terms of non-permanent talent trees and really the ability to customize and the armory and all that jazz. But the game itself doesn't reward you for actually doing that. It rewards you for pushing and min maxing and doing the best you can.
Right.
Because otherwise, even if you do like find that little niche of difficulty where it feels good to play, like I said, the game rewards higher difficulty levels. So even if you sit there for, I don't know, a few hours, eventually you're gonna get bored and be like, hey, I want to like feel like I'm doing something. I'm actually progressing. I'm actually achieving something, which then just gets you back into that like treadmill of like, okay, then I'll just try to min max my character again, and get to the
Right.
next torment.
So not everything can be equally good, right? So there's got to be a niche of things that are like the best way to equip your character, the best way to use a specific class. And since the
Right.
point of the game is for you to become as to go to the highest possible difficulty level, you're always shoved into that corner of optimization, that maximum. If you want to keep doing what the game is like that is the game is getting to higher
Right.
difficulties.
Exactly.
So you're right.
Right.
Like to play the game is to force yourself into a maximum playstyle that is
Right. Yeah.
very confined by definition because with most optimization problems, there's one solution.
Precisely. Yeah. Exactly. Which is, especially when you have really limited as a player, you have limited gear and limited resources to work with, and your job is to optimize that. So that just dynamic gets really kind of tiring for me as a player. And I'm like, and I get semi existential. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, why am I playing this?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I tend to not be able to stick with it too long. But and there's other things that they've put in, seasonal journeys, and like I said, the hardcore dynamic that adds a new layer to it. So there's tons of really good stuff about it. I think just the core hitch of it, like I said, that gameplay basically just encouraging that treadmill and always feeling like pressure from the game itself to do better, um, is really it feels like there's an infinite number of ways to play it, kind of, which means like I feel like I want more direction actually,
Hmm.
like here's all these things, and this kind of gets us to the next point, which is could just be entire nostalgia on my part, but think about games that I grew up with in large part just had a fixed difficulty because the designer had a very specific thing he wanted, they wanted you to experience, um, and you get to play through that, and if it was well tuned, then hopefully it'll hit that sweet spot between feeling like you've achieved something versus just a cakewalk.
Right.
And then when you complete the game, you're like, yeah, I did this thing. I completed this precisely the way it was supposed to be done. And and you can just kind of know that and have that, and that feels better to me than like, yeah, I guess
Mm-hmm.
I can run rifts pretty easily with my whirlwind barbarian on like torment 10.
Right. Yeah,
Like
that's
that doesn't feel as good, like,
it's an interesting problem, right? Like, I mean, I've
so
experienced what you're talking about. It's almost like you have to find the game.
yeah, kind
Like
of.
after I've played, probably I don't know how many hours of Diablo 3, but I've got a level
Mhm.
70 character. I've played through all the content. I legitimately
Right.
don't know which bosses are supposed to be harder than other bosses because
Yeah.
we mess with the difficulty all through our playthrough. And so
Hmm.
I don't have a
Yeah.
good sense of like, oh, this guy's really tough, but this guy's kind of a pushover.
Yeah.
Because
Exactly.
we could make it, I mean, we could play the first boss on Torment 13 and they'd be insane.
Right, and get more good.
Exactly.
Yep.
So
Or
it's
put it
really
one
hard
torment too low and just curb some.
it's really hard to know what was the flow of this game supposed to be? What was the difficulty curve
Totally.
supposed to be? Which we'll get to difficulty curves in a second. But
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
I
good point
don't
too.
I don't want to miss the point you made, which is Blizzard gives you so much autonomy in Diablo 3 to play with items. Now with the cube, you can use
Yep. Yep.
powers from items you don't even have equipped. The combinations are insane, but
Yeah.
you're also the design of the game forces you to sacrifice all that autonomy for the sake of progressing. And so
Yeah. Exactly.
it
No. Yeah.
feels very dichotomous because you're like
Hmm.
it feels like what Blizzard is doing is giving you more and more room to explore. But
Hmm.
then the game is saying no into this little
No,
box
this is
because this is the only way to do good.
exactly. No, precise. No, it's a great way to put it. It's a great way to put it. Is like, yeah, I have like all these different items, and really like 20 of them are usable in
Right.
large part to actually progress, right? Um, so yeah, no, that's a great that's a really good way to put that. So I guess the last point I'll make about Diablo was, as I was thinking about it, I don't want to necessarily say that Diablo's bad in that regard. That's just a style of gameplay that I don't like. I said, it can't really
Right.
keep me
Right.
too easily. But when I was thinking about like, okay, so what does keep people there? I mean, there is some level of we talk about very often like what do the designers want you to get out of that, and it's out of their game. Um, and the most cynical side of me would just be to keep on playing, keep you on that treadmill,
Mm-hmm.
kind of indefinitely. But there's another level of like, yeah, no, it also Diablo just feel maybe the point of Diablo and action RPGs like that, like dungeon crawlers, is just to kill things
Right.
like and feel good about that. Beautifully. The game is really beautiful in a lot of ways. It's incredibly smooth. Combat's really fun and really satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's all that game has to be, and the progression systems are all secondary. But that's just not the type of game that I again that can't hold me for too long. So maybe that's just me, but it does do that part very well.
Yeah, if all that you want from the difficulty is the progression, I guess, is it has to be enough to keep you coming back and slaying monsters. And like it's not really designed to do much else other than that. Like so that you can kill monsters and it feels less monotonous because there is actually something happening. Even if
Right.
on the balance you look at it and you're like, I'm in the same place I started. Um,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
enough to make you feel like you're going somewhere. It is like a treadmill. Like it's you aren't actually going anywhere, but you're still
You're moving.
exercising something. Like you're still doing something.
Yeah, you're doing stuff. Yeah, exactly. And like, there's I don't know. There's some level of that being what people look for in games. Like I don't feel much when I play Diablo.
Right.
Like like I much of anything, either frustration or triumph or elation. There's I tick off my bounties. I play rifts. I farm stuff. I do inventory management. I compare numbers, all that jazz. There's not too much feeling that gets
Right.
evoked, right? When the last boss, you can just, like you said, set like one difficulty down and kill literally in 2 or 3 seconds. You don't feel anything when you see that character. You don't feel anything when you see Diablo. You don't feel fear or necessarily even triumph when
Right.
you beat him. But again, I gotta recognize that many people play games to specifically not feel things. So
That's true. And we may at some point come back and do an episode on Diablo 3 and some of its shortcomings, especially initially in its release.
oh
But
yeah,
I
we
I
talked about doing that. Dude, I could do an entire episode on like Diablo 3 versus 2 and 1 and why it's so different.
Yeah, and I think that would be great. But just because you mentioned feeling, because feeling was such a part of two, and
Yeah,
the fact that you didn't
and
feel
one.
anything,
Very
yeah,
much.
and one. I haven't played one, but I assume that feeling was a big part of it.
Oh,
But the
totally.
fact that you didn't feel anything when you saw the butcher, I think, is attributed to what you're describing. The fact that
Yeah,
the
yeah,
game really doesn't cause you to feel much in general, because
yeah,
you're risking very little and you're rewarded with fairly little. Um,
yeah. It's just kind of this never-ending treadmill.
but
So
okay, we got to move on.
all
We've
right,
got so many games to
that's
cover.
enough about Diablo for now. You were talking about difficulty curves.
Yes, yes, I was. So, in any game, you want to introduce players to ideas and concepts in the beginning, in kind of a soft-handed way, right? You don't want to
Hmm.
even on like the most hardcore gamer doesn't want you to just like show up and presume you know all the mechanics to this game. Um,
Right.
and so usually stuff's going to get harder over time. So when you start off at Pokemon, the first creature you run into is going to be like a level 2 Pidgey. You're not going to like run into a level
Right.
50 Rapidash that's going to kill you in one shot. Like that just wouldn't be fun.
Right.
So things are going to ramp up over time for you as a player. And so
Right.
in any game, there's going to be a difficulty progression, or at least most games. I actually would say in
Yeah.
Diablo that does kind of get lost because the
Yeah.
difficulty is so
Very much so.
customizable. But
Yeah.
so there's that kind of difficulty that just sort of happens as you progress from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, if it has a beginning and end. And then there's more, I guess, direct difficulty settings in some games where you can say, I would like to play this game on, let's take Halo, on heroic or on legendary. And so it's going to automatically bump up the difficulty for you. Now, in a game like that, you're still going to start off on the same level, and there's things about the level
Right.
design and things about the encounters that are actually easier at the beginning than they are at the end.
So you're fighting grunts and like one elite in the first levels of Halo, and then at the end you're fighting whole packs of elites and scarabs and yada yada yada. That's true on any difficulty.
Right. And so they didn't choose to actually change the encounters as much as the stats and the health. But that's the idea of a
Right.
difficulty curve, the idea that time spent playing the game should cause you to have to think more and be more mechanically skilled um, later on. So,
And get better.
and some games can even have something called a skill filter, where you you all of a sudden the game will get a decent bit harder, and you're kind of stuck there until you figure out the thing that you need to learn in order to beat this part of the game.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like with Dark Souls,
I mean the Taurus demon, right? Like the idea that it's the second boss
right?
that you run into, and the only pretty much the only way to beat him, or at least at that point is to climb a ladder and drop down on them, right? To just do that multiple
Right.
times.
Yeah. So you have to know how to
And if
do
you don't
that.
do that, remember we just died over and over. It's pretty much impossible unless you figure out this new. It's not even a new technique, but remember to use this technique.
Yeah, and you do have to discover it, and that is a way of teaching you a mechanic, is to
Right.
um, prevent
Make it impossible without
right
that mechanic.
prevent you from advancing until you discover it. And I think it's a particularly brutal way to introduce somebody to a mechanic, but within a
Yeah.
game like Dark
Yeah.
Souls, it fits with the brutal theme of the game.
So.
So anyway, that's a brief introduction to the way that difficulty curves progress. Old arcade games had very steep difficulty curves because they wanted you to put more quarters in the game, right?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
difficulty curves have notoriously become shallower over time with
Yep.
most games because
Yep.
just the way that games target the largest market because that's where the money is. Like I'm not faulting games for that, but you end up
Yep.
appealing to players who are average. So hardcore
Exactly.
gamers
Yeah.
start to feel like these games are easy.
Yeah, and that's so 2 points off that. One, which would be like in general, actually, you see kind of the at least just as I'm thinking on the AAA, mostly console games that I've played. But in terms of difficulty, it actually tends to be slightly opposite. You actually tend to like the difficulty curve, of course, increases with the game, but I think that tends to be actually outstripped by the power progression of the player as well.
Yeah.
Like there's two of them, right? Like you get more powerful as a player
Hmm.
as well. And I think in general, that's like we're talking about relative difficulty here, right? Like sometimes it actually feels like the game gets easier, even though you're getting more, either harder enemies or different types of enemies or different encounters, but you're getting all these crazy tools, and suddenly it's actually like the game doesn't actually get much harder throughout the whole
Right.
time. You just kind of get more tools to deal with with more things, and sometimes, like I said, I feel like that power curve actually kind of beats the difficulty curve, and it gets easier.
Yeah.
I've definitely played games like that. But again, that's like you said, that definitely appeals to that's what people want, right? That's in general for people that your average gamer, they probably want to be able to feel that that power, that progression, and feel a lot better. So, and the other point was the mass majority of gamers. This will tie back in, but the mass majority of gamers, like you said, kind of want to go to that point, and I think that's why we've seen this big, huge growth of hard indie games,
Hmm.
basically. Like we talk about like really
Right, like
difficult
Super Meat
games,
Boy and I Want
but
to
like
Be
the
the
really
Boshi and things like that.
right, stuff like that, or even just like Ori and the Blind Forest, and um, my roommate got that at the summer Steam sale last. It's Xander, if you guys listened to the last episode, um, and I was watching him play it, and he played this one level like 40 times, trying to get through it. But anyway, I feel like that's a place that the indie games market has kind of stepped into is the people who do want these really really finely tuned and in large part very challenging games. Um,
Right.
but that is definitely a minority. That's there's a reason they're indie devs and not you know
Triple A.
Activision
Right.
putting those out. Um, but yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right in terms of games necessarily to some extent tuning that difficulty curve pretty darn low nowadays because you want people to keep on playing your game and
Right. You want people to be able to get through the game if that's what they want to do. I think that's a sentiment in a lot of games. Like we don't want to prevent the player from advancing. Um,
exactly.
and in old games, you actually there wasn't that mentality because, again, with arcades there was the quarters. With early console systems, there was game rentals where somebody could rent your game,
Sure.
but you didn't want them to beat it in a week because you wanted them to have to go buy it, not just rent it from
Right.
Blockbuster.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a good point. Never thought of that. It's just that's such an obsolete
right.
thing now. But yeah, no, you're totally
Exactly.
right. I remember renting. I rented tons of
And
games.
so because there's no
Right.
incentive
PS1.
for designers to make their game last a long time other than it would be weird if you released a game and someone was like there was 45 minutes of content. Like that probably would look bad from a PR standpoint, but financially there isn't actually much incentive if it's just a standalone console game.
Totally. And then and as thinking about like just that difficulty curve, that's an interesting idea too, right? Because like even as we're talking about it, we're kind of taking for granted that like that there is one difficulty you're playing through, right? Like we're talking within a realm of hey, you've selected the difficulty, then the game has a natural
Right.
curve to it. Of course, you can step outside of that in most games and select various different difficulties. there's this weird thing of like, yeah, that normal curve that's put in place by the developers originally. Like I said, I'm just in this place where I'm really pro like one difficulty just being there, and then you getting to experience that natural developer difficulty curve that the developer put in, as opposed to changing the difficulty manually, and then suddenly that curve, it's impossible. It's got to be impossible for a developer to like control for every different difficulty that they put into the game, and then make sure the game curves
Yeah,
well.
well, typically difficulty is sort of an afterthought to give the game replay
That's
value.
probably
I
true.
mean,
Yeah,
so they design the game for the first playthrough, but I think a
that's a good
lot of
point.
times they don't design it for the sixth. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
because
for sure.
and that makes sense, right? There's going to be diminishing returns only if small percentage of your players are even going to play the game six times, and so
Right.
I
Yeah, precisely.
again I don't fault them for this,
Comes about
right?
resources.
In terms of a resource constraint, that makes sense, but we like to talk in ideals here, and I actually like that about our show. Um, and I
Yeah,
think to
yeah,
make a really good game, you do need to consider what is the person going to get from this game when they come back on the fifth or sixth playthrough. Um,
yeah,
and it's tough if you just layer on difficulty at the end to say that there is anything other than
yeah.
we can talk about some of the things that start to fall apart when you do just slap on higher numbers on enemies, because inevitably the game does end up being like ridiculous at certain points you didn't realize because you didn't actually have
Yeah,
people playtest all the modes and all the ways that you could play, because combinatorially there's an explosion there where it's like, try
totally, totally.
nobody okay, I don't know this for sure, but I find it unlikely that somebody actually play tested all skulls on Legendary with Halo, 3 or whenever they introduced skulls. And
Yeah, I think it was
yeah,
three, like the quote unquote mythic
right. And
difficulty.
so like that probably wasn't even a thing
Eh,
because
they probably didn't spend a whole lot of time doing
yeah,
that.
I mean they so they may have done it once or twice, but uh,
Yeah, maybe just make sure it's finishable, but certainly not trying to tune the
right,
experience
and
for
how
you.
could they?
Yeah,
But I think
yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's actually a really good argument for having a unified difficulty through the game, um,
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
becomes
and
incredibly resource intensive to try to tune for different versions of the game for different players.
that's the other thing. Like we were talking about those two different types of difficulty, like just scaling, change, basically just changing the numbers and multipliers and all that jazz. Um, and that's of course, like you're talking about, like difficulty is probably one of the last things. That's just inevitably, necessarily, just
Right,
way easier than adding in tons of different. Like at the end of the day, you just change these things and then add an option menu before the game, and it kind of that's not a long feature it doesn't require a whole lot of developer
right,
resources, right? So it makes total sense why that's the one that it goes to. But I also like the idea of kind of the law of unintended consequences of like, hey, this enemy, like just scaling doesn't always make entire sense, right? If you have a certain mechanic on a certain enemy and then boost it, an enemy that used to be kind of like reasonable is now suddenly like just ridiculous. There's one enemy that's really annoying in Diablo 3. Actually, I'm thinking of that is in lower level. It's called an assassin, a winged assassin, and it's really quick and it darts in and does a lot of damage. And at lower levels, you kind of have enough uh, damage mitigation and gameplay is a little bit slower and they're very reasonable. At higher ones, just because like the way scaling works, sometimes they'll just like jump in and one hit you immediately.
right.
So like enemies like that don't work as well because their health, their weakness is supposed to be their really low health. But in this case, when like there's no even amount of reaction time that you can kill them, it doesn't.
Right,
It's
it can
difficult.
feel
So
almost like is this how they intended for the game to play? Like,
yeah, exactly. Should this
and
feel this
I
way?
mean,
So
even with any basic pack mechanic in a game, like if you introduce, because of the way that combat works with packs generally, unless you've got AoE combat, you can take down one target at a time. And so, if you increase a
right,
pack of enemies' health by 10%, you don't make it 10% harder because you have to take
right,
out the targets one at a
yeah,
time. And so every target stays up 10% longer, and I don't have the percentages on me. You could do the math, but it doesn't end up being 10% harder. It ends up being
right,
harder than that.
right. Percent. Yeah, precisely. It
Hmm.
compounds on itself. Well, we're pretty darn good. At least I know this about myself. I'm good at picking
Right.
apart things and finding things that are problems. But what are some solutions? What are some better ways, at least in our minds, to
Yes,
do this?
that's good.
What are some
What can we
next
say
steps,
positively
as it
about
were?
difficulty and how it should be done?
Yeah, yeah. What
Yeah,
should be done
so
instead?
I think that you always will end up at a place where there are going to be people who think your game is too easy and they don't like your difficulty curve and they wish it was harder. And I don't know if there's any
Right.
good way around that. I don't really like the introduction of the artificial difficulty levels that you mentioned. A game that I think actually I really like this about games is the way that Final Fantasy VII did their weapons as like these secret super
Okay.
bosses, and Kingdom
Oh yeah,
Hearts
those
did
ones.
that too. With you didn't have to fight Sephiroth, but you could, and it was like he was even stronger than the last
Yeah.
boss that you had to fight. And I think
Yeah.
I actually really enjoy that as a player. There's this idea that okay, the final boss isn't even like the hardest thing. There's actually this other even harder thing, um, and
Yeah. And kind of like Pokemon, almost even the original ones, where finding Mewtwo in Trillion Cave is like the real end game, not beating the Elite Four.
yeah, or I think it's in the new Pokemon games, the Elite Four is harder the second time, and
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
there's an idea of you can finish the game, but then there's actually still more to do,
Yeah.
and I'm a fan of that as a way to increase difficulty, but more generally, difficulty is good and is well done in a game when it augments the core experience that you want the player to be having.
Yeah.
Um, and I mentioned this in passing with Dark Souls. Dark Souls is a brutal, punishing game, and
Yep.
so when your deaths and your defeats in Dark Souls are brutal and punishing, you feel more like you're playing Dark Souls. You don't feel
Yeah. Totally.
pandered to. You don't feel like you're pulled out of the game experience because you are either having a difficult time or having an easy time with the game. Um,
Yeah. I mean, even in terms of the world, like we talk about fantasy and feeling like you're a part of the world and actually feeling like you are the thing you're playing. And Dark Souls is perfect with that. I mean, in terms of this bleak and very dark fantasy world where you're basically an undead. You're they call it the Hollowed. Um, that's but you feel very much like that, right? As you play, and you get murdered multiple times. That probably is what a very dark world like that would feel like. It reinforces its own
right?
narrative
Yeah, there's death around every corner,
mechanically.
and
Yep.
the aesthetic definitely matches that with Dark Souls and even more with Bloodborne. And but actually, as a player, death is around every corner because your character might literally die.
Yeah, totally. And I don't know, and that's so again, like we said, I don't think it's not so simple as just making games hard for the sake of being hard.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's good. That's not the answer. It's like you said in the case of Dark Souls, it really augments that experience. I think again, and feel free to sound off at us, but I just am of the opinion I think of game developers wanting game developers to have a really clear vision of what they want the player to
Right.
experience, and then really and I I'm not a game developer and I understand this is stupidly hard, but then really ensuring that the core mechanics and specifically the difficulty are precisely tailored to achieving that. Um,
Hmm.
so whatever that looks like, like talk about like Super Mario 64. People won't usually don't hold that up as a paradigm of difficulty.
Right.
Um, in terms of like you don't see people throwing the controllers, but that's also one of the most beloved games of all time for a multitude of reasons. It feels challenging. It feels there's depth to it, and you really get the sense that this is kind of exactly the way the game is supposed to be experienced.
Right.
And then even past that, there's like with platformers specifically, where you're collecting things in general. There's that similar idea. Like I'm thinking of Jack and Daxter right now, the original PS2 series, where you can beat the game without collecting everything. So if you want to play more Jack and Daxter after you beat the game and make it more difficult, you don't select the higher difficulty level. You go and find all the stuff that you couldn't find the first time.
Right. Now that you have completed the
There's
game.
exactly there's more content basically.
I actually,
Um,
because you brought up Mario Kart, I think that that's another good
wait, I
example.
brought Mario 64.
Oh, you brought up Mario 64. I'm going to bring up Mario
Yep,
Kart, um,
that's fine.
which I think does difficulty well, like Dark Souls. And I don't think it's.
Yeah,
Oh, yes, that's right. We're comparing the
finishing
two. Um,
Mario Kart
so
64. We're going there.
Mario Kart isn't good. The difficulty curve isn't good because you can increase the CC from 50 to 150. Like that doesn't blow anyone's hair back. You
Right.
just your cart moves faster. It's good because of the rubber banding AI. And some people might be really pissed off about this because, like,
Oh
no
yeah,
matter how much better you do, the AI will still keep up with you, which could feel kind of cheap. But you've got to understand that the core to the experience of playing Mario Kart, it's a go-kart game. You're in a
yeah,
pack
you're racing.
of other players. They're throwing items at you. It's chaotic, right? Like that
Right.
is what you want from Mario Kart. And it's not a drag racer where you get ahead and then you're just ahead the rest of the race,
And you stay ahead.
right?
Yeah,
So like that's not the
that's the way
experience they
to.
want you to have. And so blue shells are introduced and rubber banding AI is introduced so that you've
Right, and there's
always got
not
a challenge.
right precisely. And there's not too many, and I think specifically in this case, like there is some artificial just like letting the computer win right there, like with the rubber banding
Yeah,
effect. But I think it's okay because like the other solution would be introducing lots of other mechanical gameplay catch up mechanics,
right.
right? Like I said, like you said, the blue shells, blue stars star to an extent. But that's really kind of the only huge, if you're way behind, ways to get way back ahead. Um, but that's because, like you said, I think the core gameplay of Mario Kart is kind of this close pack mentality. It's all the items are kind of designed around that, as opposed to everyone being super separate and super far
Right.
away. And so, in that case, I think that's like actually a good example of kind of letting the computer cheat a little bit because that's just letting it get back to precisely what it's supposed to be, um, instead of having to design all these other potentially exploitable items around it.
Right. Yeah, and
So
so we probably will sound a little bit like we're contradicting ourselves, but I want to clarify like games can be hard in different ways, but as long as those ways augment the core experience of the game, what's good for one game might not be good for another game. Like Mario 64 would not work if it was punishingly difficult like Dark Souls. It would be
yeah,
weird.
exactly. Yeah, it'd be really weird. I'm sure someone's done that, like modded.
Mario Souls,
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I'm
Mushroom
sure that
Souls,
exists.
yeah.
Yeah, basically Mushroom Kingdom Souls. Or whatever. Um, but yeah. So that makes me think of like we said, kind of this sliding scroll of gameplay difficulty. One thing that we also talked about a little bit, and we can just kind of um, touch on here or talk about more, but is difficulty in multiplayer games, which is an interesting idea, right? Because so far we've only been really talking about single player experiences, and
Right.
that's really probably not the mass majority of games anymore. In just a purely, I don't know, that might not be true, but it feels kind of true at the moment. Um, and you're talking about there's different types of difficulty, right? So like on one hand, like I think about like StarCraft 2 or Dota 2, right? Those games, people tend to say those games are really hard, right? Really really difficult games. And it's interesting because we're using the same word to talk about different things. Like on one hand, of course, yeah, the reason that those are hard is because to be really successful at them, they're just really mechanically intensive or really really deep games. There's something you have to learn. There's something you have to be good at. You actually have to practice to be good at them in multiplayer. Um, but the actual difficulty of
Right.
the game itself when you play it, right, is in fact the person you're playing against. That's where difficulty comes in from in multiplayer games. Is there's no developer ordained way to play necessarily, right? It's all about if you're better than the other person, then it'll feel easy, and if you're way worse than the other person, it's going to feel damn near impossible. Um, so that was an interesting little kind of like think about Overwatch, right? We talk about that a lot. Like, yeah, you get in a bad lobby, you get stomped, it feels like a really hard game. If you get a good one, it feels really easy. But and then there's that other type of difficulty. Like Overwatch is not a complicated game by any means, right? Like it's part of the beauty of its design is you get in and you got a left click and maybe three abilities top,
Right. It's pretty straightforward.
and then suddenly you can play the character. As opposed to StarCraft, where you have to like begin talking about build orders and timings, expansions, worker management, micro, macro, all that jazz.
Right, you could play all the way through a game of StarCraft and not even have built everything in the tech tree.
Oh Lord, no. Yeah, no, that's by far the norm. So that's an interesting thing. There's another spectrum for multiplayer games, it seems, which is mechanically just how advanced they are. Maybe that's the better word than difficulty. But
Hmm.
then, yeah, the fact that difficulty itself is just entirely ordained by who you're playing.
And I think it really highlights a skill cap for a game. I mean, we talked about tic tac toe and how like that doesn't have. No matter how good the other person is at tic tac toe, you could be just as good as them because the skill cap is so low.
Right.
But in a game like that's not tic tac toe, like Overwatch or PUBG that we talked about, or Hearthstone, because there's a high skill cap. There's a lot for you to learn, and so you can. I would argue that you can increase the difficulty in a similar way, in a controlled way, as a developer with artificial intelligence. Of course, it's very, very hard to have an AI that is able to push people to think creatively.
Right.
But
Yeah, we
people
talked
will
about that last
always
week.
push each other to play creatively.
Hmm.
And the problem is you have no curve, right? So with the lobbies, it's not a gradual ramp up. It's sometimes you get a bunch of noobs in your lobby, and
Right.
sometimes you get that veteran player who's like he's smurfing on an account, but
Yeah,
he's
sure, sure. They're just
actually
gonna.
challenger tier or whatever,
Right.
and he'll just gonna stomp you.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
and so there isn't an experience of having the difficulty ramp up. So it feels a little different and maybe a little bit spottier.
Right. I just realized this, which makes sense. But that's basically the whole idea of ranking systems, right? That's the idea of skill rating or MMR, is to try
Hmm.
to balance out that gameplay. That's the whole idea of it is its own little difficulty curve. Is the idea of hopefully getting this niche where you're and most games, at least a lot of competitive Blizzard games anyway, competitive games. I don't know if this is true across the board. Talk about trying to find that 50-50 win ratio, where if you're winning half your games, that's kind of where they want you to be.
Hmm.
um, and that being the ideal. That's how they balance their matchmaking. So that's an interesting thing is that even multiplayer games have this developer component of it, which is trying to make sure that trying to balance basically your experience of it. It's just a lot harder because the way they do that isn't just by programming it out and designing it specifically. It's trying to make sure that you meet the correct people to give you that really subjective experience of balanced
Yeah.
difficulty.
Yeah, matchmaking has got to be such a hard thing to do well because you're working at um, in an indirect way on very complicated components, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like
Yeah.
you're trying
Things
to
are
match
totally out
up
of control too.
two people or two teams of people who might be good, but might be good for completely different reasons, and you're
Yeah,
trying to figure out which ones go together.
yeah. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't really thought of that before. Matchmaking is basically just difficulty scaling,
Hmm.
and doing that correctly.
It is kind of like we almost trippy to put it in the same vein as like a Diablo 3 scaling system, right?
Sure.
Where you're like, what's the point of learning to play this game better if I'm just going to be matched up with people who are that good?
Hmm.
But
Better than me.
in a way that like that idea of matching skill and then playing more skilled people is that. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah, very much so. In that case, it's just I feel like that one like it's easier for people. It'd be easier for me to do that. Like I don't feel quite as bad when I spend a lot of time playing Overwatch as Diablo because I feel like just for me at least the experience of getting better and beating a person at something feels better than just having beaten the game a little bit more. You know, like you're right. It is a pretty similar to treadmill, but like yeah, in that case, it's just the experience of having gotten better and being able to beat someone who's better than you. And that's just a really universal human thing. That's sports. That's
I mean, it is universal, but I think there are certain people who really appreciate a skill treadmill versus just a growth time invested sort of treadmill.
sure.
And so I hate just calling games treadmills all the time because it
Yeah,
feels
I
really
know.
demeaning, and I know
Really minimalist. Like yeah,
they're really and I really I do enjoy games, and I think that they are artistic and a great form of entertainment. So I hope people don't hear me as diminishing games, but
yeah. We're not above games here. We love them.
yes,
That's
we are
part of
not
the
above
slogan.
games. But I think the treadmill metaphor is just so accurate because you're doing something. You're not doing nothing,
Right.
but you aren't like going anywhere. Your point of reference isn't changing, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah. Precisely.
the game, you're still losing 50% of your matches, like
Right.
in this
Yeah.
case. But you are getting better.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, that one that's a good point too. Is like in Diablo, at least with that comparison, right? Where you might not necessarily get any better. You just get the drops you want with
Right.
gear, and then suddenly you get this power spike, and you can play at higher difficulties. With Overwatch, or a multiplayer like something like even Dota, or just kind of multiplayer based games where you play a lot of matches over and over, Hearthstone. You pretty much have to get better. I mean, you don't. There's no. Is with those games at least. There's no kind. I guess Hearthstone's an exception in terms of cards, but you don't unlock new stuff that makes you better. The only reason you get better is because you've gotten better, or gotten there's some level of luck there with teammates, but in large part, it's you can climb with skill, and that's worth it to people. That's worth people coming home and spending their time doing that. There's and that's not a bad thing. That's like that's part of games. So that's a
Hmm.
very interesting kind of counterexample to what I might have been talking about, slightly derisively or divisively.
Hmm.
Um, of just people, maybe that's just enough that it feels good to improve and to get to the next thing. Um,
Well, I would be remiss if we covered difficulty and didn't talk about flow. And
sure.
I didn't brief you at all on this, but
Okay.
uh, there's so many videos out there that when they talk about difficulty, they talk about flow. And the point,
Define that real quick.
yeah. So the idea of flow is that you're in a state of mind where you're focused and you're being productive, but you're not frustrated and you're not bored. So if you go too high on the challenge, you get frustrated. If you go too low, you get bored. You want the person to feel like they're accomplishing something, they're progressing, but it isn't overly frustrating or
Totally.
annoying.
Yeah, it's something it's talked about tons in psychology, actually, particularly in terms of work, is being able to enter this state of flow where, like you said, you're confronting problems, but it's not frustrating. It's engaging, and in theory, it's like kind of the ideal state of problem solving,
Right.
where you're utilizing a lot of resources and tackling things and going from one thing to the next, and really kind of in a very Nirvana-esque state almost.
Hmm. Yeah, and people are frustrated by different things, and so I think that's where you get these really diverse desires for difficulty. Not even in just in degree, but in kind. Like
Yeah,
some people are frustrated by having to replay the same boss 20 times,
right.
and if they played Dark Souls, they would break their controller in half.
Yep.
Um, and some people are frustrated by having to spend 2 hours to do something in a game just because there's an artificial time limit. And those people aren't going to play Eve, right? Where it's
Right.
like you click a button and then you wait 2 hours and now you have that skill. Or sometimes it's 4 or 5 days. Like
Yeah.
it can be a long time. And so if somebody's frustrated by that experience, they probably aren't going to play that game.
Man, we should do a whole episode on Eve Online. That's such a fascinating
It is, yeah.
little universe.
There's a
It's
lot
really
of things to
impressive.
talk about with
Very
you.
cool. But anyway, no, that's a good point. And so I think the last part we'll talk about is just kind of death in video games and punishment.
Yes.
Um, you know, what you do with failure and how games approach that. Because you're talking about like certain people would be really frustrated dying over and over, or running like a boss. And when we were talking about this right before, in the pre-show stuff, we were thinking about Left 4 Dead again, obviously, and how there's actually a very punishing checkpoint system, in that there's really not one in that game. The campaigns, the game's broken into different chapters, and a full playthrough. If you're to play through and kind of succeed in one chapter the first time, I don't know, it's probably like a 20 to 30 minute investment.
Yeah,
I'd
probably.
say 20, yeah, maybe 20 25. Which is actually a lot of time if you fail 15 minutes in, and then you have to start back over and try to get that correct 20-minute playthrough. And in general, we were talking about, hey, that doesn't sound fun, right? That doesn't sound good. Where if you that sounds almost too unforgiving, right? Where you fail
Right.
something and then have to go all the way back and do the whole thing over and over again. And the reason I think that worked with Left 4 Dead is what we talked about last episode, which was the dynamic AI and the procedurally generated levels, where yeah, you're in the same physical space, but it really is different every time slightly, and maybe just even that slight difference is enough to I don't know. I didn't at least feel too frustrated when we'd get stuck on a level and have to play it, 12 times. That
No.
extra couple hours of time didn't feel wasted or frustrating. It felt like a good challenge and something to overcome. And then of course the payoff, which is another thing inherent with difficulty, when you finally beat something hard, that's way better than beating something easy. To put it simply.
Yeah, and it does keep the player on their toes. It prevents them from getting bored because there's dynamic difficulty built into the game. Like it isn't going to hit you with the exact same things every time. Um,
I mean, so that's one example, right, of pretty punishing failure. Like for Left 4 Dead's case, it just sends you back, right? You start the exact same way you were. It doesn't penalize you. It doesn't make the game harder, but you just have to do it again, and you have to get it right this time.
Right.
And there's a lot in a row you have to get right. So that's one way that death. The other one, right, is being you still restart, but maybe less punishingly so, but you just lose stuff, right? You physically lose if it's an item based game, then you lose items. That's the way Dark Souls works in general. When you die, you lose all of your currency, your souls, unless you can get back to your body and reclaim them. But you tend to, in Dark Souls, you tend to not get thrown too far back. There's if you choose, you can kind of put your chuck points pretty decently well. You don't have to move too far through areas. So that's an example of it being kind of more punishment in that regard. Diablo, right, where if you die, death is really not too heavily punished in Diablo.
No.
But in theory, your items lose durability, and if you die enough times, then they break, and then you have to pay money to repair them.
Right. And there's a tension, right, between how punishing do we make death, because if you make it too punishing, it can be frustrating for the player, it can feel unfair, it can feel like arbitrary. And if it's not punishing enough, then death loses its sting. There's nothing for the player to want to stay alive for. Like, it's not a big deal for, like, if I'm playing a boss in Diablo and I die fighting them, I can just respawn a corpse and then I just keep going. Like, there is a limited number of times I can do that, but it doesn't. I don't sit there wondering like, oh, I hope I don't get hit again or I'll be dead. Like, I mostly don't care, and like I'll avoid really obvious attacks, but I haven't learned the broadcasting animations for Diablo enemies because I haven't needed
You don't
to.
need to. Right. Yeah. Precisely. And that's difficult, right? I mean, I think in general, just failure in games, like we've said many times, you have to have your player coming back, and but at the same time, you should also want some incentive for the player to not die.
Right.
Second you take that away, you lose all sense of tension in a game, especially if it's story based. Then that's super not good. And then you have like multiplayer games, right, where death is built into it. That's you're not going to go through a match of Overwatch without dying, or you shouldn't anyway, or Dota, or so on and so forth. And at that point, it's just kind of resource based, right? Time, you lose time. That's really the thing you lose.
Right.
And we can capitalize then, for you both lose time as well as give the enemy more time. It's just a swing.
Whenever you have somebody dying or failing, you want them to not only have failed, but ideally you will have pointed out a way that they could improve, right?
Yeah, exactly. It should be a learning experience, right?
I mean, ideally in games, that's what failure is, but there definitely can be situations in games where you die and you're like, I have no idea what I was supposed to do there. Like, most people have had, okay, I'll speak for myself. I have had the experience of fighting a boss and thinking, oh, I'm supposed to lose this battle. And then getting a game over screen and being like, I was supposed to be able to defeat that enemy?
Yeah.
Like, and realize,
it's supposed to be doable.
right, like not even knowing that I'm supposed to be learning from this experience because I need to do this for real.
Yeah.
So
That's another little thing I really don't like about variable game, like changing difficulty in games, is that if you know there's a set game, like if there's a set difficulty and there's just one way to do this, then you know that the game is beatable, right? Like this has been designed this way, and there's even in your deepest the long night of the soul moments where you've lost so many times, that this, in large part, I don't think I can think of a major game that that is actually completely unbeatable, right? Like there's something to cling to in that, just even mentally as a player, no, this is actually doable and I can do this if I figure it out, as opposed to the temptation always being there in lower difficulty, which is like, nah, maybe I just can't, maybe I just can't do this. Maybe I'll just lower the difficulty.
right.
And that's I think there's something great about that, like, sense of losing over and over again, but knowing like, no, this is definitely possible. Or like in puzzle games, right? Like there's a solution to this. I don't see it right now. I feel like I've exhausted every option, but there's definitely an option that I haven't seen it yet. You don't like increase the difficulty of puzzle games to the point where they like reduce, like potential solutions. And like if you get high enough, it's just like, no, you're not like you can't be under geared in a puzzle game to the point where we're like, oh no, sorry, you like actually can't solve this puzzle at all.
Yeah, that's true.
There's no solution. you know.
Yeah, in a
Um,
game like The Witness or the Talos Principle, like, yeah,
right.
you that's a beautiful thing about puzzle games is I think that because difficulty, like conceptual difficulty of the puzzles, is definitely what you're working with all the time.
Yeah.
It's it's almost like the developers can't lose sight of the difficulty of the game. Like if
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
telling a good
Exactly.
story, you might lose sight of that.
Of
If
course.
you were designing Heavy Rain, you might not be thinking about how hard is this game actually. Um,
Yeah. Very much so.
but if you're doing a puzzle game, like it's like that is the game. You aren't going to lose
Yeah.
sight of the
Exactly.
difficulty. And I think that puzzle games can actually do difficulty curves really well because it's most of the way most puzzle mechanics I can think of have got a very high skill cap where it can be
Yeah.
made very difficult to figure out how do I do this puzzle. I mean,
Yep.
take puzzles in real life. Like, if you ever buy a 1,000 piece puzzle and think like, oh, this is going to be really quick.
I think the last thing I'll say, I've just been thinking, just as I've been talking. So like, there's other stuff like I don't know, like a game like StarCraft 2, right? Think about the campaign of or the single player in that game, and that has a similar, easy, normal, difficult, brutal difficulty scaling.
Mhm.
And like a game like that, um, yeah, there's no, it's good. Like I can only play that game on normal. I can play it on hard, but it's not as fun for me. And that actually encourages me as a player to come back to it. If it was designed at a single difficulty and that difficulty had been a little bit higher than I wanted, when I bought that game, I wouldn't have played it. Like it would have been too much, and I wouldn't have wanted to put in the time to like practice. So in it's not quite as simple as just like any dynamic or not dynamic, but any like adjustable difficulty is bad, right? There's like we've talked about, different people want different things out of games.
Right.
I think the point that it gets frustrating is when it is completely dependent. Your entire experience is dependent on what difficulty you play on, and that is able to define the way you play the game,
Yeah.
as opposed to it is able to. I think StarCraft 2 is actually a good example of that done well, where each different distinct difficulty feels different, and yeah, one some of them will definitely be too hard, and some of them will be definitely too easy. I think it's that like weird little scaling where you don't know how the game's supposed to be played, and it kind of takes you out of how it's supposed to feel, and it's very kind of nebulous. Um, I think that sort of thing is what I really don't like about those different difficulty levels.
Yeah. When the difficulty doesn't really enhance the experience or muddles the experience, like it's again,
Very
it's
much
not
so.
clear. Like, okay, if you'd never played Halo and you'd never seen anybody play Halo and you're dropped into Legendary, like, okay, aside from that just being ridiculous and very frustrating as a player, the way that you would learn how to play, if you thought that that was like a typical Halo experience, but just you had to develop a lot of Halo skill,
Yeah,
you'd be
precisely.
wrong. Like,
Yeah,
it's actually a much more cautious style of play than you would have at any other difficulty in Halo.
yeah, totally. Yeah, you'd come away from that thinking that like plasma pistol mastery is the key gameplay mechanic of Halo.
Right. You'd basically leave
Like
like a really good Rainbow Six player. Like
yeah, sure.
like
Yeah, yeah, kind
it
of.
would be it's almost a different game that you're learning.
Yeah,
And
precisely.
I think that that is can be frustrating when difficulty warps a game to that extent.
Yeah,
And doesn't and that's why I think it's so important for difficulty to enhance and to fit alongside with what you're trying to do in the game. So a game like StarCraft, like I think smarter enemy AI is going to be the main way to effectively increase difficulty because you want to feel like you're a commander of an army and you want to feel like
mhm.
as I get better as a commander, I get to deal with more complex and interesting scenarios.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's
precisely.
what I would want from a game like StarCraft, and I think that's core to the experience is like feeling like a master tactician.
Yeah, yeah, and in large part, there's, I mean, outside of like I said, just a lot of mechanical stuff. In large part, that is the way they actually scale difficulty in those. It's not just units. I think only brutal makes units different in terms of like enemy units stronger than yours. It's just the enemy commander is better at what he does. You have more attacks from more different locations. I don't think objectives change a whole lot. It's just there's more things to deal with, and it's more difficult, and it just taxes that part of you. So in that regard, that's good. Um, it actually, like you said, it makes you feel more like a player. I think if it were to just scale the enemies and just force you into this really tiny niche of no, I just have to learn how to counter this one sort of enemy,
Right.
just learn how to be good at this one thing, then that wouldn't feel good, and I probably wouldn't have as kind things to say about him. So
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of balloon defense, like balloon tower defense games. I don't know why that just popped into
oh
my
yeah,
head,
man,
but like in terms of a game that has difficulty
forgot
skill,
about those.
like and that is a game where I think that increasing enemy health is a viable way to increase the difficulty of the game. Like I get
Yeah,
why that's
justifiable,
why
right?
you would do it, and I don't think anyone's
Yeah,
playing a puzzle, a tower defense game in order to see really interesting enemy AI. Like
right.
that would
Yeah,
be a very
yeah.
strange thing to expect from a tower defense game. Um,
Right, exactly, and that's again. I mean, to go back to the same thing, which is that's the core gameplay dynamic. It's how good are you at setting up these systems that can take off health from the incoming
right, you want
enemies.
to maximize the
It's not
damage.
like right, exactly, and that's what that game's supposed to be. And so, hence, scaling that type of difficulty just makes you have to be better at that type of game. And so, yeah, that works in conjunction.
Hmm.
If you guys have either thoughts or have other examples of games that scale well difficulty wise or kind of nail difficulty ones we haven't thought of, or as always, sound off at us. I would love to hear other people's thoughts and how they experience stuff, or if you don't care at all and it's entirely the more options the better. That's great too.
Absolutely. You can email Mark at gamingmechanics.net or Greg at gamingmechanics.net, and you will get the respective person for that. Um, actually,
Yeah, we
yeah,
switched them. So you email Greg at Gaming Mechanics to get Mark.
that's right.
Just seeing if you guys are paying attention. Alrighty, well, I will. I'll
All
talk to you
right,
later.
sounds good. Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.